I'm going to try to give you a little bit of history of the PSID, some of the key users, some of the key research that's done, maybe give you a hint of other things it can do, talk a little bit about how we collect it, show you how you can get access to it, and maybe talk about the next steps we have. And so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. So I'm really pleased to be here at the Blaylock lecture. I'm sure that Professor Blaylock would have loved the PSID, given its oversample of Blacks and its ability to follow different families through longitudinally. He is unfortunately not in our bibliography, so maybe that didn't have it, but I think this is very appropriate to talk about it at this lecture. So, like we heard, the PSID has been around a long time. It's been 52 years, started in 1968, but it was part of President Johnson's war on poverty. At the time, they didn't have really any way to measure people coming in and out of poverty. Actually, in 1964, they didn't even have a measure of poverty. So part of this plan created the Office of Economic Opportunity, created a poverty measure. That's when a lot of the food stamps started, and that's when they worked with Michigan to create this longitudinal study to really find out if people moved in and out of poverty. So the PSID has been not only producing research, but producing media coverage throughout its 52-year period. And so here is a study produced in the New York Times that really says, oh, poverty, there's a lot of poverty, but it's the people on poverty. I mean, a third of people go in and out of poverty, maybe a third of them are the ones that stay in poverty. And this is something they didn't know back then before the PSID. And this kind of research has actually continued to do over and over again. And we'll look at some of the new findings that looks at this, whether poverty is persistent and how persistent this is. So in the very beginning, Office of Economic Opportunity just had a new survey called the Survey of Economic Opportunity, the SEO. And they had a big sample. They ran it for 2 years and realized, hey, we need this to go on. So they contacted Jim Morgan here at ISR and SRC and said, hey, we have this sample, but it's oversample of low income and it's oversample of Blacks. We need more representation. So he created another 3,000 family sample. This 5,000 families started, and we continue to follow these families over and over again. In fact, we are now in the process of collecting our 42nd wave of collection from about 11,000 families. We've released 41 waves up through 2019, and there's in this database, there's about 83,000 people over this period, and about 3,200 people are people who were there in 1968, part of those original families. There's over 84,000 variables, and the key is the sample grows over time because when adult children leave their house and form another household, they're called a split off, and we follow them. And then we follow their children's children, and so on and so on. The big problem with this is we're just following a sample that was based in 1968. So in 1997, we added a bunch of new immigrants. And in 2017, we added another set of new immigrants to refresh the sample. So as of today, we're pretty representative of the US population. And the key is we've been collecting it first in person, then in telephone, and this year, in 2021, we started with a web survey. In fact, that's one of the research topics there'll be a lot of, is to look at the comparisons between people who answered on the web and people who answered on the telephone, because we split those randomly. So you can really evaluate different answers to questions, different types of response. So the PSID really starts with families, and that's one of the key aspects of the PSID. So if you remember your family back in 1968, your family dinner, this is that famous Rockwell painting. Well, we ask a question: how often do families eat together every day? Well, back in 1968, it was about 70% of families said that. Today, or in 2017, it was about 32% said they eat together every day. So that's changed a lot over time. The other key thing that we've done is what Christina Cross did and discussed in this New York Times op-ed, is she looked at kids who were raised in single parent and two-parent families, and then their high school graduation. And she found out that Black kids who don't live in two-parent families, that aspect does not decrease their chance of graduating from high school, where white kids who don't live in two-parent households, but live in one, does decrease their chance of graduating high school. And a lot of this is due to the other factors that are really challenging Black kids as they grow up. So that sort of gives you a taste of the PSID. And so what I'd like to do now is show you one of our videos that we did to celebrate the 50th anniversary, to give you this, I think, a great picture of the PSID, and then I'll go into some of the details as we go with that. Plus I get to take a chance to stop and you get to watch a movie.
American families. What do we have in common? How do we differ and why? What are the factors that make us thrive or fall into poverty? How do our parents' occupations, neighborhoods, and other factors influence our success? For 50 years, the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, or PSID, has been exploring these and other questions to help better form public policy and improve our quality of life.
PSID is the longest running nationally representative panel survey, which is a longitudinal survey in the United States. We follow families. We'll follow their children, their children's children, their children's children. In fact, I think we have some families that have 7 generations in the PSID.
It began in 1968, the year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and the Vietnam War had no end in sight. But there was another war going on.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
To help better understand the dynamics of poverty and the effectiveness of its new programs, the Johnson administration's Office of Economic Opportunity approached researcher Jim Morgan at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research to help implement a study. The team developed an innovative panel study design that would follow the same families year after year, instead of selecting new random samples each year. Frank Stafford joined Morgan's team as a doctoral fellow and is still doing work on the study today.
The first important finding was that in one year a family could be in poverty, but the next year they could be out of poverty, and that there were many transitions into and out. The news experts were convinced without any evidence that there's this persistent culture of poverty. Nobody gets out. This was a hallmark finding, which is still true today.
It's a real example of how some people were foresighted 50 years ago and made the effort to start something, which at the time was for a clear societal need, that over time we also realized was important for scientific research and a really broader range of policy questions.
As American families and the economy have changed over time, so has the study. Despite budget cuts and changes in funding sources, the survey has continued to expand its scope, adding expanding questions on health and life satisfaction, as well as supplemental studies, including the Child Development Supplement, the Transition into Adulthood Supplement, the Disability and Use of Time Supplement, and the Well-Being and Daily Life Supplement. Same-sex couples and recent immigrants have also been added to ensure the survey remains representative.
The interviewers build a rapport, I think, with our respondents. And some of the respondents who've been in the surveys for so long are excited, yes, I've been waiting for your call. So we get 93, 94% of the people who we interviewed 2 years ago interviewing again.
Following Jim Morgan as PSID director, researcher Greg Duncan continued to examine both the transitory nature and the persistence of poverty, concluding that the heterogeneous nature of poverty experiences demands a heterogeneous set of policies to address the needs they create. This led to additional research by Mary Jo Bain and David Elwood on the dynamics of welfare participation, which played a key role in the welfare reform debates of the mid-1990s.
The PSID gives us data that is really not available anywhere else. It gives us data on important variables like household consumption, which is really important for a range of macroeconomic questions. That's information we don't get from other sources. We certainly don't get another source that can tell us how much a household spent on rent or spent on transportation in 1972, and how that's changed over time for members of that household or for new generations.
The research I'm most struck by is talking about how profound the effects are of deprivation early in childhood. So the effects of being a very small child, say in the 0 to 5 range, and if you have deprivation, if you have hardship during that time, how that lasts, 30, 40, 50 years, you're still more likely to have severe health effects, even to die younger. And I think that's something we wouldn't know without the PSID. As policymakers are weighing, what's the importance of investing in kids when they're really young, investing in Head Start or food stamps or childhood nutrition. This really lets you trace out the effects over a person's lifetime and not just in their first couple of years of life.
Some of the most notable PSID users are the Nobel Prize winners. So there's 11 of them. Jim Heckman and Angus Deaton both served on our PSID board. In fact, Professor Deaton said that the PSID has been an essential data backbone for economics and for social science for half a century. Perhaps its most extraordinary achievement is the way that it has changed and grown with the interest of the scientists who use it, not only following developing interests, but often leading the way into new territory. It truly is a national treasure.
Most research studies, you have a project and then people work with it, and after time, the use of the study for research purposes becomes less and less. What's unusual about the panel study of income dynamics is that through the years, the use and range and extent and quality of publications has become greater and greater.
We've also won awards from the National Science Foundation. NSF gave awards for the Nifty 50. So when they turned 50, they said, oh, well, PSID is one of the key accomplishments that NSF have funded. And again, when they turned 60, we were part of their celebration. We also received funding from the National Institute on Aging and National Institute of Child Health and Human Development.
With nearly 30,000 users and 5,000 publications, PSID makes its data available at no charge to researchers.
It's really available on a very open and equal access basis to researchers all over the country.
The PSID has done an incredible job investing in online infrastructure and ways to access the data, because it's a really crucial resource. It tells the story of this country in a way that nothing else does.
The impact of PSID has been global and has inspired similar studies in the UK, Germany, and beyond.
So everybody says, oh, PSID, you have your 50th anniversary. What's the next 50 years look like? So that's a challenge, is where do we take PSID?
PSID will be looking to increase online data collection, taking a closer look at immigrants and health, and examining the impact of retiring baby boomers and intergenerational relationships on families.
How do those intergenerational impacts affect their income or their health or their general well-being? And I think that's what we'll look for the future. PSID is America's family tree, because we can follow these families through and watch the tree grow and create new branches and new leaves and new families.
So the key is the family. And let me sort of show you how PSID becomes America's family tree. So like we said, there's a family of studies. These are the main funders, but we've also have a transition to adulthood supplement that comes every other year since 2005, and the child development supplement, which are kids under 18, which we do every 5 years. And in fact, we've even done one in 2019 and a follow-up after the COVID pandemic, during the COVID pandemic 2020, and we're going to actually do one again in 2021, so we'll have more information about those kids. And we've had other supplements. You heard some of the ones mentioned in the movie. And we have other questions on philanthropic behavior and food security that are funded by other organizations and agencies. So The family tree starts in 1968, and so these are an example of some families that might have existed. You can see one of them had 3 generations already living in the family, and we can follow them over time into 1980 with more generations, and as some drop out or die, those move out of the PSID. In 1995, there's another generation. 2005, there's more families. Some of these family clans are getting very, very large. 2015, and if we just focus on one of these, we can see what happens in 2017. There's 5 generations. Now, obviously, they're not all alive at this time and not all present, but there's a number of different intergenerational families here, and some of them include what we would call a triple. In other words, there's an adult person who has their adult parents and their adult grandparents in the study, and we can see how those impact either their kids, the next generation, or how they follow through over time. Then you can see here the difference between here's just 2017, and we move to 2019, and there's more people in that 5th generation. And in fact, some people move in and out of the study. And what's really interesting is there's some kids that move across families. You know, they were living with their parents, now they're living with their aunt and uncle. And if we look at this particular family clan, there are 35 family units. In other words, there's 35 households where the 2 people, or the kids, or the 1 person is the separate family unit in that household. Some of these family units live together or not. And what's interesting is this is in 2019. In 2017, this particular clan of families only had 27 family units. So that also changes over time. So it's critical that we follow these families. And so this shows you how many there are in each generation. So as I said in the video, there are 16 people who are in the 7th generation of one of these 1968 families. 13,000 who are in the 3rd generation, and so on and so on. And then we've also managed to link the 1940 census to about 1,800 men who were alive in 1968 and get that information from the 1940 census, and we can actually find their families. And we hope in the future to link the PSID to many, many, many more censuses so that we can either go back further in time to get multiple generations over time, or to find more people who have either dropped out, who are families of people who are in the survey who are living somewhere else. The other key aspect is not just that we have the families and duration, but we have these people over their life course, over a long time. So what this shows is the income path for many cohorts through time. So that dotted one at the low end here, that's the oldest cohort in the PSID, and that's their income path. But you can see this normal hill-shaped income path is what economists always study, the fact that you have low income when you're young, it goes up and falls. The key thing is this group over here in blue, that's those probably the older millennial group, where they were hit when they graduated college during the last recession. And you can see their income is actually less than the cohort previous to them, even though most of the time income increases over the cohorts, right? Younger people have more and more and more. So what would be really interesting is over the next course of years, we'll be able to find out what happens to their income after the COVID pandemic. So many of these millennials will have a double whammy. They were hit with a recession when they were young and hit with a recession when they're further along in their careers, maybe having with young kids. So that's the key of the PSID that follows the families and people's income over time. As I stated in the video, the response rate is tremendous. So we get about 94, 95% of the people or families who were in the survey the last time. It's collected every other year. So we collected in 2017. Of those, 94% came in. And the overall response rate will include some of these split-offs, some of these new families. It'll include what we call recontacts, families that didn't respond the last wave but respond this time. Overall response rate is 90%, which is very large for a longitudinal survey. The other key aspect of the PSID is we have extensive content. As you heard in the video, they talked about vehicle inventory. So we have vehicle inventory and expense. We have their wealth, we have their consumption, we have their housing, what their house value is, we have their participation in programs, obviously the PSID, so we have their income and employment, but we also have whether their housework, other time use categories, their computer use, their composition, their marriage and fertility history, their philanthropic giving, all these things to really paint a complete picture of the families and how they change over time. So who are these PSID users? So we have over 35,000 registered users. So I'll show you how you can register to be a user. They're economists, sociologists, demographers. It does so happen because it's the PSID. Economists sort of dominate that field. There's probably 60, about 2/3 of the users are economists. But the sociologists are growing, and I'll even show you how they're growing. And when I did the video where there are only 11 Nobel Prize winners, there are now 13 Nobel Prize winners. Two of the ones in 2 years ago were Nobel Prize. One did their dissertation on the PSID. There are 12 American Economic Association presidents, 23 PAA presidents. We have a distinguished board of overseers. And to me, one of the best statistics we have is we have over 1,100 dissertations. And then because we have 6,700 publications, we have one every 1.25 days. So this shows you our increase in publications over time. What's interesting is even in 2021, already by May, we've had almost a publication a day, right? So there's been a lot of publications coming out. The key thing about the dissertations, just like we have multi-generational families, we have multi-generational dissertations. In other words, somebody writes their dissertation on their PSID, their advisor wrote their dissertation on the PSID, and that person's advisor wrote their dissertation on the PSID. So we have a number of these 3 generations. We actually have a 4-generational PSID user. They didn't all write their dissertations, but they're in the bibliography of somebody who had a graduate student, who had a graduate student, who had a graduate student. And that's really exciting to see these dissertations of people who have the PSID. And that's one of the reasons why we love doing these talks, to get more people to use the PSID. And the publications come out in some of the best journals. So in the past 10 years, these are the journals with the most PSID articles. And it used to be a couple of years ago that AER, American Economic Review, was the journal with the most most publications. And now it's demography. So demography, there are many more sociologists who are using and publishing the data. The other thing is those next two are macroeconomic journals. We have many, many macroeconomic people who are using the PSID because they have income, consumption, wealth, and now they'll have time use. So they'll be able to do their lifetime budget constraint, maximize and use the PSID to solve for all the parameters. So one of the things that I think that PSID is best used for is this whole idea of this multi-generational dynamics, the cross-generational impact of income. So here will be a graph of children who are like in the bottom quintile by their parents' income, and what quintile they're in, what quintile they're in when they grow up, right? So you divide everybody in 5 quintiles, bottom 20%. If they're in the bottom 20% when they're growing up, what percentage of those kids do you think grew up and remain in the bottom 20%? I'll let you think of your answers, right? 43% of those kids who grew up in the bottom quintile are now stuck in the bottom. So let's talk about how many experienced the American dream. So what percentage of those kids who grew up in the bottom quintile end up moving to the top? Only 4% move to the top. And then we can fill in and see where each kid moves as they grow up in the bottom quintile where they are. And then we can look at the entire spectrum. And then lo and behold, we can see that there are 40% who grow up in the top quintile who are still in the top quintile. So having adult kids, I like this immobility. I like the fact that kids are stuck at the top because I'm hoping our kids will be stuck at the top when they grow up. But most of the time, through society purpose, we want more mobility occurring in the country. And what's really interesting is this generates a lot of press and a lot of articles that look at this mobility concept. And two articles sort of tell a different picture of what I just showed you. First one talks about the American dream is alive and well, right? Because people are growing up and moving out of the bottom. The bottom one says the American dream of mobility is broken. Look at the numbers. Well, depending on which you look at, you could say, oh, right, the glass is half full or half empty. 43% of it stuck at the top, but that means 53% moved out of the, was stuck at the bottom, but 57% moved out of the bottom. So this is usually how people look at the PSID, depending on what you want to see in terms of mobility. That's why it's key to have the data to look at this. And then you can look at some of this issue of absolute mobility, people who are stuck at the bottom and stuck in poverty. So this recent study just came out a few months ago, joint with American Enterprise Institute and Brookings, on people on the opposite ends of the political spectrum, but they joined together to look at poverty persistence, one of the things PSID is known for looking at, in Black families and white families. And so they look probability of an adult today that they were is in the bottom fifth, right? And Blacks are more likely to be in the bottom than whites are. But the key is the probability of adult today in the bottom fifth and their parent was also in the bottom fifth, right? That's a much bigger discrepancy between whites and Blacks. Only 5% of whites are stuck when their parents are stuck. And then you look at 3 generations, the probability that your adult, your parent, and your grandparent, it's almost nil for whites, but it's 20% of Blacks are multi-generational poverty. And the nice thing with PSID, we have income, we have consumption, we also have wealth, and you can find some of the similar things. The racial wealth gap, right, is large, right? White women have much more wealth than Black women, and we can even look at this whole multi-generational thing through a data visualization and see that you can see that Black children who are in the bottom 20% are more likely to stay in the bottom 20%. So all these kids, the purple dots are Blacks, the orange dots are whites, and you can say 46% of Black children who are in the bottom quintile of wealth remain in the bottom quintile of wealth when they grow up. In this visualization, you can even look at the middle, you can look at the top. That's what's great about doing these visualizations. So in my view, one of the best ways to use the PSID is by looking at this multi-generation and life course process that people grow up in, and then where they grow up. So one of our restricted data, you can get access to the PSID linked to the census tracts and counties and so on. So this group of researchers, Hillary Hoynes and others, got access to this, and they looked at where kids grew up and where food stamps were rolled out. Well, if you remember, food stamps were started back in 1968, and they were rolled out differentially through the country. So the darker areas are where they came out later. So you can see they looked at where kids lived and whether food stamps were available in their county when they grew up. And they found that girls who lived in places where food stamps were available were much more financially independent and much healthier when they grew up to be adults. And boys were healthier, their financial independence didn't change. But this shows how food stamps and where you grow up can really impact the long-term well-being of children. The other thing is PSID is pretty much everywhere, right? You can see it in the research, you can see it in the publications that we produce, but you can even see it in the popular media, and you can see it in some of these talk shows.
impacts to integration. Not because the mere act of having a white classmate is somehow magic. It's not, unless, of course, that kid has round glasses, a scar on his forehead, and sits alone on parents' visiting day. But getting to attend a good middle-class school can be transformative. Berkeley professor Rucker Johnson studied black siblings where one went to a desegregated school and the other didn't. And not only did those exposed to more years of desegregation fare better, but their kids did too. And that is not all.
Blacks who attended desegregated elementary schools were more likely to graduate and 22% less likely to be incarcerated as adults. What is more, Johnson found that the narrowing of the achievement gap and the increased success of black Americans did not have any negative effect on whites, on any metric.
So it was good for black people and had no effect on white people whatsoever. It's like this...
Yep. So what's key here is Rucker did the same type of thing that Hoynes et al. Did. They were able to go back, find out where kids grew up, link that county, that school district, to the schools and whether it lived in a segregated or a desegregated area, and found that the blacks who grew up in the desegregated area did much better and the whites did no worse. So this has generated a lot of other research by Rucker. He has a book, Children of the Dream, but the key is that this research gets out and John Oliver gets to talk about it. So the other thing that we're trying to focus on for the future then is what can we do and how can we evaluate the COVID pandemic? So one of the key things is the PSID is situated perfectly to evaluate these changes. So back in 2019, we were out in the field, we collected information about people's health status, all their income and employment. And then we go back again, and now we're collecting information about people's employment in 2019, their income employment in 2020, their health status in 2021. So we will be able to see, we'll have information about their monthly employment, how that changed during 2020, when they were working, when they were laid off, when they were not working, their living situation, their total income, and their health status. We'll be able to see that their health status changed from 2019 to 2021. But to really hone in on this, we even added a few questions to help us evaluate those. So obviously we asked, did you obtain the vaccine? Have you been tested? And we found that most of these reference people, the people we're asking, 50, 60% of them are currently saying that they've been vaccinated and tested. Now, this is preliminary data. It was not weighted, so we don't know if those are accurate, but it gives us a picture of what's happening. That we also asked whether they received both of the economic impacts payments in April and December, January. And then we asked them whether somebody's working from home and whether one of them family has an essential worker. So we'll be able to compare that to the wealth of information we have about their working, their occupation, to look at which of these they're considered essential workers, to evaluate what happens with the pandemic. The other thing we did is we asked them, what kind of financial difficulties are you having? And how are you dealing with those during the pandemic? Now, the interesting thing is we also asked these similar questions in 2019 when there was that federal government shutdown. So there was a government shutdown in early of 2019, and we asked whether they did this, and we can see there's a big difference. So almost everybody said, how'd you deal with it? We cut back on spending, right? 65% said they had to use their savings, 50% filed for unemployment insurance. But what's amazing is, there are 35% who obtained help from their families, and 28% or so are using the food bank and support service. So we'll be able to look at these answers and then see what they're actually doing. What do they do with paying? How much did they pay for rent? How much debt did they have? Did they actually get unemployment insurance? So now that you're so excited about this, how can you get access to the data? Well, you go to www.psid.org and you can click on the Get Started, and it'll show you how to get started on this, you can go and look at some of the videos. We have videos on how to use the data. You can look at the different studies, documentation, whatever. You can go to our pubs and meetings and look up a publication, or you can just go straight to the data center and go and search a word, type in religion, and you'll find out that we have a little bit about their religious preference. You can type service and you'll find out how often people go to church services. You can type in food and you can find out, well, we know what their expenditure of food, we know their food stamps or SNAP, and we also find their food security. How often do they ever go without food? You can just type in a word here and search and click on the data and see, is that variable in our database? And you can then download a file and compare this. Obviously, you still have to register and get that information as well. The other thing you can do is you can go through the ICPSR replication data. So what we've done is we created an open ICPSR, a PSID repository for researchers who've used the PSID and created an extract. So you can either start your deposit if you've done it, or you can go in and browse PSID deposits. What's even better in my view in terms of replication studies is ICPSR now hosts data from journals who require you to submit a data set that goes with your publication. So the AEA, through the AER and all their other journals, sends the files to ICPSR, and you can find those files on the PSID. So this is one publication that's in the AEA that looked at increased attachment of women to the labor force, how it changed the family's ability to smooth income shocks. You could go, you can download the data and rerun the analysis to replicate the results. And my suggestion is you can do this in a couple of years and change the years and look at, well, has this changed since the COVID pandemic? Or what did it look like of recession or not? And look at different time periods using the same analysis somebody done in the publication to get a better idea of what research you would want to do. So there's a lot of these data sets out there. Many of them are available in Stata or SAS or something, and they all have the pretty good documentation because I've seen this. These people are users, PSID users, so we know what they've done. So I want to sort of end with what other types of things are we doing and what might you be able to do. So like I said, we're starting with an internet collection. So we've gone in the field. We started collecting in March, and we've developed the instrument so that some people could answer it on the web. Now it's a long survey. It's 85 minutes, sometimes 90 minutes, because you can see all the content we had. Plus, we have to get all your family relationships and those types of information. But now some people can go and collect it and do it on the internet. And we find when we looked at their debriefings, a lot of people like to do this because they can do it over a period of time. They can check their records and do other things. Some people are responding, said, I really miss my phone call, because you can imagine some of these families have been there since the beginning. This is their 42nd time doing the survey. And many of the questions remain the same. A lot of the content remains the same, but they get used to this. They like to have this conversation and talk. The other thing, like I mentioned, we have new immigrants. So we've added some questions about their assimilation into society, into the US. And so I think it's going to be really key in the future to evaluate these new immigrants. Sorry, let me go back to the internet collection. So since we did a random sample of this, some people who might be interested in methods will release a lot of the paradata, and you'll be able to examine questions by mode. So in my view, one of the interesting things I'm looking forward to looking at is looking at that food security question. So the question is, have you ever, how often have you not had enough to eat, right? Enough food to eat. And so some people suggest that some people might answer differently if they're answered on a self-response versus to an interviewer. My guess is the income questions won't be any different, but some of these other questions might be. The life status question might be. Now, preliminary look at when we look at the differences, there isn't that there's much differences on the 5-scale life satisfaction, but there might be others. And that would be really interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes to respond. There are some ways we can compare the quality of the data by doing benchmark studies to compare averages to the current population survey for income or the survey of consumer finances for wealth. And again, and then second, for new immigrants, we'll be able to look at their responses, their income, their relationships, where some of their family is from. There won't be the largest sample, but we have probably over 2,000 to 3,000 immigrants in the survey. Next year also, we're hoping to collect saliva to look at genetics. Now, we've done this on the Child Development Supplement. We have a number of children and their caregivers on their genetics, and we're just starting to evaluate that and release those data. But what we hope to collect later on, either next year or the following year, is the saliva from 3-generational families. So to get the child, their adult, and their grandparent. This will be the first data set that has multi-generational information on genetics to really see some of these comparisons between their social characteristics like their income or their education and their genetics. Then, like I said, we really hope that people will use this to look at the impacts of COVID-19, both the pandemic and the health of people. You can compare the health of people who were there and what they report as their health status or their other chronic conditions. We will hopefully be eventually able to link the PSID to geography again to get characteristics of the spread of COVID across the country and look at how that impacts differentially people living, maybe the spread of how school closures impacted different people in the PSID. And finally, and one of the things I really want to push is more multi-generational research. So a lot of people use the PSID and look at the long-term behavior. And then a lot of people they'll run a regression. You can get today's outcomes and throwing in an outcome from 10 years ago. But very few, and it's just starting, you can find it, are looking at more than one generation. So what happens, how do the grandparents impact the parents, impact the kids? Or there's a number of families where the kids are now living without an adult in the household, but with their grandparents. And how has that changed over time? And not just how has it changed over time, but how has it impacted the kids and what happens when they grow up? So I think that multi-generational research will be very key to evaluate research using the PSID. One thing that we can do with these relationships to focus again on the family is we have a project where we've now mapped all the people in the family, all the residents living in this household, to everybody else in the household. And you can see, well, resident 2 to resident 2 is self, but resident 3 is the step parent of resident 2, resident 4 is the parent, and so on. So we can find the siblings, we can find all the relationships within the family, and then look at the kids and the changes in the relationships over time and over the decades. So in other words, this is the average number of biological parents who live with a kid. So back in the 60s to 70s, there's 1.78. Obviously, if you have 2 parents, it's going to be 2. So there's a mixture of 2 and 1, and there might be some zeros, but not many. And you can see, as all of us know, the presence of 2 parents fell to the 1980s to 90s. But that's been pretty flat in recent periods. So it hasn't changed much. So the number of parents that a kid is living with has remained fairly flat. Then you can see the dynamic. So what are the entries and exits of these parents to a kid? So the average kid had 0.24 entrances of another adult, another parent, but 78.78 parents left the household, which makes sense. That's why you get this downward trend. And that exit rate was pretty high and increased to the 1980s and 90s. But since the 1980s and 90s, it's actually fallen. And so is the entrances. So the entrances and exits have fallen over the period. So there's maybe less churn for a kid than there was before. So you want to learn more, you can go to the website, www.psid.org. You can also follow us on Twitter. So since we do have 1.125 publications per day coming, or no, every 1.25 day, sorry, there's a new PSID publication. We try to update this. So there's probably a new pub put on our PSID Twitter page every other day. Maybe not every other day, maybe once a week we update it, but there's a lot of publications. So you can just follow us on Twitter and find those new publications. We have over 1,700 followers. This is more followers than HRS. Just want to say that, more than NLSY. Obviously not as many as GSS, or not as many as the Understanding Society, the British panels, or some of the other ones, but there's a lot, we have a lot of followers who do this. And what's nice is you can see people then comment on the papers. Oh, great paper using the PSID. Oh, I use that data as well. I've done this analysis. So that's, I think, one of the nice things about Twitter is you see this interaction with some of the data users. We also have an annual workshop through ICPSR. We have a summer workshop that brings in 25 to 30, usually new students or graduate students or new PhDs who want to learn how to use the PSID. So you can sign up next summer. It was in June, so you can watch for that for next summer to sign up and learn more of the PSID. But I think you could just go start on the PSID.org website and just start playing with it, downloading a data set and looking at the important information that the PSID has to offer. So I thank you. I thank you for coming. I thank you for listening. I hope you reach out, and we have plenty of time for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wow, my mind is reeling, and I've seen a couple of questions come in, so we will take those first. And I do want to mention again to all of our attendees, please do type in questions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a Q&A button, and you can type in those questions there. So this question came in a bit ago, so if that helps you formulate what this was regarding. This person asks, what do you attribute the high response rate to? And I believe that's just in general, but if the person who asked that wants to clarify if there was something more specific, feel free.
So we were actually wondering about this. So last wave, and I think even this wave, last wave we asked, so to our returning PSID, so why do you participate in the survey? And we found many of them because of the scientific nature of the PSID. Some of them, it's the family responsibility because the family's been doing it forever. We've heard people say that, oh, well, even there's one interesting story that somebody said that when they got married, part of the agreement was they had to complete the PSID of if they were asked to do it. We also find that many of these families, so you can see those trees that I show, how many different families there are. So in many of these families, there's a matriarch, and oftentimes that matriarch actually helps us get response rate from other people in the family. And so this is used a lot. So I think people get used to it, and they like returning, they like the information.
That makes a lot of sense. All right, another question. Do you have any favorite publications, recent or past, that involve the PSID?
So I think I mentioned two of them. So the one by Rucker, I really like. The one by Hoynes et al., I really like on the food stamps. And I think the best thing about that is that was actually quoted and referred to in one of the economic reports of the president a number of years ago. I think there are some that I'd like to see redone. So there was a paper by Joel Tonji and others looking at is the extended family, extended family dynastically linked. So in economics, one of the big things is, How do you smooth your consumption, and do you bequeath stuff or not? I think that needs to be redone because it's an old study. I think it'd be nice to have it re-estimated again. I do think the one that was referred to in the video is the Bain and Elwood study. I think one of the most interesting things is they were one of the first to look at this change in people on welfare, basically on AFDC at the time. And they found that a lot of people moved in and out of welfare, but there was a lot of people who remained on welfare for 5 years. I think almost half the people were on welfare for 5 years. Well, you can imagine when they released that study, and then David Elwood became head over at HHS during the Clinton administration, and that generated this whole change that generated the whole welfare reform, because people saw that, they said, oh, we got to change this. There are people who are on welfare for a long period of time. So that's what's really exciting when you see some of the uses of PSID in policy. And then finally is the one I talked about on mobility. When you see mobility studies being done from researchers that have a political bent to the right and a political bent to the left, both using the PSID to evaluate that, because it's this whole idea of intergenerational transmission and mobility and impact of parents is important to both sides of the political spectrum. So that's what's great when you see the PSID used with both sides of the political spectrum.
Very cool. It must be so exciting when when John Oliver all of a sudden pops up with something and you go, hey, I know that one. And I'm sure your Twitter just goes wild.
Yeah, so actually there's also one by Hassan Minhaj, who's more up to date than John Oliver. So my kids watch Hassan Minhaj. They might watch John Oliver, but Hassan Minhaj had this whole study on charitable giving. And the first figure he shows is the percentage of people giving to charity over time, and you can see at the bottom, you go to the PSID. So yeah, it's really funny when you're watching TV and a PSID study pops up. But it's almost more enjoyable to go to a conference and see one of the students in your summer program present a paper on the PSID.
I bet that must be an incredible feeling. We had 2 questions that were submitted in different ways, so I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. This question says, the PSID was funded by the federal government as a critical data collection to understand poverty in the United States and to track the successes of the war on poverty, which you mentioned. With more than 50 years of tracking data, how has the nature of poverty in the US changed, if at all?
The nature of poverty. So that's a hard one. So my research mostly is on poverty measurement. So I think the key thing that the PSID helps us to do in terms of poverty measurement is to show the impact of government transfer programs. So one of the worst things, so I do poverty measurement. So those of you out there, if you're going to study impact of poverty, you should never use the official poverty measure to study the impact of poverty. Because with the official poverty measure, if there's an increase in food stamps or an increase in earned income tax credit, that will not impact official poverty because it's not included in the measure. So all these new checks that people are getting on the child tax credit will have no impact on poverty. So when you see all these people saying it's going to reduce poverty in half, they have to use a whole different measure of poverty. And I think that's what's important about the PSID, because it has all those other components. And what you find is these transfers make a big difference. So EITC lifts a lot of people out of poverty. Food stamps lifts a lot of people out of poverty. And that you can use the PSID to find out. And not only that, but you can use the PSID to then find out, well, do kids, when they grow up getting the EITC, does that have long run implications of their growing up? And yes, you find yes. So I think the biggest thing the PSID helps us to look at the changing picture of poverty is poverty programs help. And they help in ways you might not think. So like the one study on food stamps, the fact that everybody thinks, oh, sure, it's going to help them in the long run on health self-sufficiency, but no, you wouldn't think it's going to help their health or those types of things, or might help their their view of life, their ranking on the life satisfaction scale. So I think that's the key about PSID at Let's. Unfortunately, the thing it does, it shows that hasn't changed is the racial differences in poverty. It's still large, right? Blacks are much more likely to be in poverty and stay in poverty than whites, and that's been true since the beginning. So that's the unfortunate thing that shows hasn't changed in terms of poverty dynamics.
Well, maybe there's someone here in attendance today who can take some of these data and do something about that. I mean, I think what we have heard over and over again in this presentation is how these data can affect policy and affect lives. So, so that's my challenge to you. One last question. There is a current focus on growing income inequality in the United States. What has the PSID taught us over the years about income inequality in America?
So I could give you a whole nother presentation about inequality because that's my research topic. So maybe that was a setup. So a couple things about inequality. So income inequality has increased over the past 3 decades. The PSID can show that in terms of the disparities. It can show, like I showed, in terms of wealth disparities. Income inequality has increased in wealth disparities. And what's great is because PSID has a consumption measure, the PSID can show that consumption inequality has also increased over the period. Now, this is critical for an economist. So anybody who knows any economic theory knows that you're usually taught this life cycle theory that what do? Your income fluctuates over time, but you smooth it so your consumption is perfectly smooth. So there's no real change. Well, we find that's not necessarily the case, that consumption inequality actually rises along with income inequality. And what we can also show through PSID and other data sets is this concentration at the top goes across all 3 dimensions. So the people at the top, right, their top wealth, their share of the wealth has gone up, their share of the income, and their share of consumption. But one of the most interesting things is the cross share. So in other words, there are more people at the top 5% of all 3 measures. So, when you look at the people at the top 5% of wealth, more of them are also in the top 5% of income and the top 5% of consumption over the recent period. So it really suggests this concentration is a big deal. However, that's just the top 5. The inequality has actually gone up within the period. What we don't really understand is the picture that I showed before, showing the kids and how they grow up, and 43% of kids at the bottom remain at the bottom, but 40% of kids at the top remain at the top. We sort of know about them, but we don't know much about those ones in between, right? So the ones that are actually crossing the income spectrum across quintile. And so that's why we also have to look at mobility. And we find that income mobility has actually fallen over time. So mobility means what's the chance that you're going to rise up to another income quintile. That's actually fallen over the period, as well as wealth mobility as well. So that's one thing I think the PSID shows us about both inequality and mobility, that you think that the United States is a land of opportunity. Well, it is for some, but not for everybody. And I think that's what's really, really key. And I think what needs to be done, and if people want to do more research, is to find out what really helps in the mobility, right? So what helps people move up and down the spectrum, as opposed to just stay at the bottom or stay at the top.
Oh, there is so much to dig into there. And that's interesting. It looks like it popped up another question from someone. So I'm sorry I lied to you. This is your last question. Does the PSID have data on children in foster care?
So I think we have I'm pretty sure we have children in foster care. The key is, I don't know what we have about them. We know they exist, but I'm going to cheat and look it up. I know we also have in our child development supplement and the transition to adulthood supplement, we have more information about those types of kids. So I don't know, we probably have their existence, their presence in the foster kids, but we don't know, you know, where they're coming from or where their parents are. So it's yeah. So you'll know if there's a you'll know if there's a foster kid, but we don't know, and you can then find out who they're living with. But I think more of that information would be available in the transition to adulthood supplement and the child development supplement to give you more information on that.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that live look-in. That was great. Wonderful. Well, I know that typically what happens is that people kind of think about this, and then, you know, at 2 a.m. there's a question that pops up of, oh, I wish I had the, you know, the presence of mind to ask this. So if those questions do come up, we would love to connect you with those, Dr. Johnson. And may I say how fantastic this presentation was. I have learned so much, and I'm seeing in the chat as people are chatting to us how much this meant to others who were attending. So thank you so much for being here. And to everyone else, thank you so much for joining us for this Blaylock lecture. I do want to let you know the next Blaylock lecture will be on July 27th, and that is Dimensions of Public Attitudes Towards the Affordable Care Act, 2010 through 2017, and that is with Dr. Will Hobbs of Cornell. So thank you all so much for being here. From all of us over here at ICPSR and the summer program, thank you so much to Dr. Johnson. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. And yeah, if you have questions, please contact us.